Hi, and welcome to the second part of the Pro mounting system for Unreal Engine 4. While making the previous videos, I discovered just how long these videos are starting to get, so I decided to break them up into smaller parts. So this is a continuation of the previous part where we set up the character. On the second part of this video, we're going to be getting into setting up the mount itself. And then after that, we'll be looking at setting up the controller, which will be the final video for part 2. Sorry for the bit of confusion in the numbering, but that's just how it ended up coming out. All right, so the next thing we're going to be working on is setting up our actual mount. So to do that, let's go to Blueprints and open up the horse. So just like before, the horse has a unified controller pawn, and then it's got the specialized mountable pawn interface. And almost all of these functions are going to match what's on the mountable pawn component. So just like the character, you're going to have the prepare to mount and prepare to dismount. Just like the character, these are preparation functions. So the only thing you really need to do here is make sure that this returns true. If you have some logic that you want to implement for this particular function that'll stop the horse from being, quote, ready for mounting, then this is where you do that. Mount or rider here, this should be for the horse, or for your mount. This is going to be the rider that is currently possessing it, or currently trying to mount it. Not necessarily possessing it, but any character that is trying to get on top of it and ride it. So we have the mount, returns true, dismount, return true. All right, so the next thing is mounted. The isMounted function is pretty simple in usage in that we just get the pawn mount component and say isMounted. We feed that right in there. So all this does is, if there's anything currently mounted to this character, this is going to be a Boolean function that returns true. The next part is character mountable. This is a horse, so maybe there are instances where this character isn't mountable. Maybe you have a demon horse that derives from the regular horse. For this, this function exists basically to be able to turn the mountability of a animal or vehicle on or off, and depending on a situation or whether it's a subclass or something deriving from a mountable character that has all the logic and things that you want already set up, but you just don't want it to be mountable, this is where you can set this up. Or vice versa, you have a non-mountable character that for some reason has implemented this interface, and this version you want it to be mountable. Things like that. So what I do for this one is I get the mountable pawn component, and I get this function called canMount, and hook that up right there. Basically, all this function does is there's a flag on the mountable pawn component in the seat manager that basically says is mountable right there. So we want to turn that on. We'll talk more about this section a little bit later, but for right now, make sure the is mountable flag is checked true. And we can ignore the rest of the seat manager there. We'll come back to that later. This is how you basically set up the seats. So next up is get character pawn. And this function is specifically designed so that if you have the horse, you can get the driver that is possessing this pawn or this mount. And so for this function, we always return get driver. If there's no driver, then this simply returns null. The next one is get mount. This will always be the mount itself. Oops, self. And then the last one is get controller. And in this case, because it is a mount, it always has a controller of some sort. So we can pretty much just call get controller. And so whether it's the player controller or the AI controller, this will always return the controller currently possessing the horse or the vehicle or whatever it is. All right, and that's it for the ADM controller pawn. Next, we go to the mountable pawn. Okay, so just going down the line here, we're going to open up set seat occupied by ID. These functions, both of them, set seat occupied by ID and set seat occupied by index, allow you to set whether a specific seat on the mount is occupied. And you can do this by the index of that seat within the array. So if I go up here, see the seat here. These are this is the seat manager that all the mountable pawn components have. These are the seats that you can put on there. If I add one seat here, which we're going to anyway, you see that it has the seat ID. And for the driver's seat, I'm going to say that seat 0 is the driver's seat. And so I'm going to say the ID is 0. We'll get into more about this a little later, but basically the seat ID is something you can set for each different seat. And it's kind of important to make sure that each seat has a unique ID. Otherwise, you're going to have collisions in seat IDs and trying to get them set. So you can start at 0, 2, 3, 4, however many seats that you could possibly want on your mount and set and give it an ID. I'm going to keep this one at 0. So this function sets that a specific seat is occupied by its ID. And the mountable pawn component has an analog function for this already. Set seat occupied by ID. Now, for the most part, you're never going to have to call these functions. This is all built in and part of the mountable pawn component. But if you ever need to do something crazy like customize the logic or this and add some other way of occupying a character or a mount, then you have these functions completely available to you to use. So we're just going to drag the seat ID in there, drag the writer in there, and then return whatever this function returns. The same thing we're going to do for set seat by index. The set seat by index occurs by the actual index in the seat array of the seat manager. So let's grab this component, then set seat occupied by index. All right, so must have driver. This function is hooked up to the mountable pawn component. So we grab that and get must have driver. Basically what this function does is if a character approaches a mount or a vehicle and it interacts and starts to get on, if this component is set to force driver seat, that means that the first pawn to possess this, the first pawn to mount this mount is always going to be the driver. So we're going to always force you to get into the driver's seat first. And this is a pretty heavily used function when determining what seat the player is going to be assuming and getting into. And then you have is seat occupied by ID and is seat occupied by index. These are analogs to set seat occupied by ID. This allows you to query if a particular seat at a specific ID or specific index is currently occupied. So is seat occupied by ID. And just going to pass this right on in. And then is seat occupied at index is going to behave pretty much the same way. Pass the index in, return if it's occupied or not. Okay, and then we have is a mountable pawn. Yes. Basically, this flag just says this pawn, this mountable pawn is mountable. This function does exist also in the unified controller pawn, and maybe is character mountable might actually be deprecated in a future version. Right now, they both basically kind of just do the same thing, but for different instances, which might cause problems later on. Just make sure that the implementation of is character mountable and is mountable pawn are basically identical. So one thing you can do is grab this and just plug it right in there to make sure everything stays cohesive. Again, I think that the is character mountable might become a deprecated function in later releases, so just be aware of that, since there is a duplicated functionality here. The next one is mountable by pawn. Now, this is a very useful function that you probably want to add in for your prepare to mount and prepare to dismount functions. Basically, it checks to see, the idea of this is you send in the writer that wants to mount this, and you can check to see if this particular pawn has the rights to mount this vehicle or horse or mount or whatever. Maybe they need a key, maybe they need the license, maybe they need to be the specific person who tamed this creature or built this thing. Either way, this is where you would set up this logic. And for demonstration purposes, we're literally just going to say, yes, anyone and everyone can mount this character. Is driver seat. This is a newer function that didn't exist in the previous version, but it streamlines a lot of the checking to see what a driver is. So similar to all the other functions, all you have to do is get the mountable pawn component and then get is driver seat. And feed the seat data right in there. So this will check according to whatever current seat your character is mounted on, gets sent into this function, and checks to see if that particular seat is the driver's seat. And what that does is basically allow you to specify a seat other than ID of 0 as the driver's seat. So I can say a seat with an ID of 1 is now the driver's seat, or 10 is the driver's seat for whatever reason that I've set that up for. And then has driver. So has driver, grab mountable pawn component, get has driver, and connect that right up like so. Okay, so next on the list is get seat data by ID. Now this is going to be useful if you need to actually retrieve any sort of seat information from the mount and do some processing logic on it. And as usual, the mountable pawn component has this function already built in. And all you have to do is supply it the ID. And of course, it returns true or false in the instance that maybe it doesn't find a seat by the specified ID. So you can check to see, did this succeed? And then if it succeeded, then you can break apart the seat ID structure or the seat structure and get the information you need out of it. Get seat data by index is the exact same way. At index. Get relative position to mount. This is a very important function. This function allows you to customize the different locations or ways that a pawn can mount the mount or the pawn. Mount or the vehicle. So because this is a horse, for simplicity's sake, we're going to say that you can get on it from either the left side or the right side. Now, some vehicles might be a little more interesting, or even if you wanted to be a little fancy about it, you could say that you could technically mount a horse from the front and the back by, grabbing onto its neck and then jumping around and mounting, or, grabbing its rear rump and then hoofing yourself on all fancy like. So there's different ways you can set this up, but in this particular instance, we're just going to say you can mount from the left or the right. And to get how this works or how this is calculated, there's a built-in function for the mounting system. And it's part of the mounting system function library. There's actually 3 of these, but the one we're going to be using is called get angle from right between actors. There are 2 other versions of this. Get angle from front between actors, and get angle from top between actors. The top, right, and front being the important key identifiers here. So what this does is it gets the angle between the horse and the rider from either the right side, the front, or the top. And so the main actor is going to be ourself. And we're going to put that right on in there. And to get a really good idea what this actually does is there's a handy dandy tooltip here. It gets the angle between the right direction of the main actor to the position of the target actor. This can be very useful in determining field of view as well as what side the character is mounting to. In this case, everything is from the right, so if the target is on the right side of the main actor, then it's going to return 1, or a number between 0 and 1, something greater than 0. If it's right in front of the main actor or right behind the main actor, it's going to return 0. And if it's to the left of the main actor in any way, then it's going to return a number between 0 and -1. So this is pretty useful in calculating what the field of view is going to be like. And so, as usual, if it's greater than or equal to 0, we're just going to do a branch. Like that here. True is going to be right side. And false is going to be left side. And there we go. And this is how you calculate what position the character is going to be mounting from. as a throwback to one of the previous functions that we implemented where the position was coming in. I think that was mount character. So if I go to any one of these, as you can see, this position, that function is actually where position is calculated from. There is a standard stock implementation of that function, but I find it's best to override this here because not every vehicle or mount is mounted omnidirectionally. So, a spaceship might be able to mount from top, bottom, left, right, forward, or back, but that doesn't make sense for a car or a horse. Okay, so next in line, get relative dismount direction. Now, we could set this up the exact same way that we set up the previous one, but really we're just going to say always get off on the left for our sanity in setting this up. Basically, the main idea for this, so if you want to do something special with this, one of the things you could do is get the rider's controller and the direction that they are looking at from the controller. So if they're looking a little to the left or if they're looking a little to the right, you can actually use that to calculate whether or not you want them to dismount to the left or dismount to the right or whatever it is that special circumstances you want to dismount them for here. Get mount body. This does exactly what get rider mesh did, and that is it gets the body mesh of the mount, the main mesh that you want to attach it to. Let's see, get mountable pawn component. That's one of the standard functions that all of these interfaces have, and it allows you to get the mountable component from this actor. Get max riders. This one's pretty easy to implement. Grab this. So get max riders is basically dependent upon the number of seats that our mounting component has. Get num seats. So we can just feed it in that, and that is the maximum number of riders that our mount can handle. Get driver is pretty straightforward. Same thing, get the driver. Get current rider count, mountable pawn component. Get num riders. Find available mounting position. All right. So this function is given a rider location where your rider is currently standing, usually whenever you interact with the mount. And then that other function called relative position to mount gets kicked off and feeds this position variable right here that comes in. So the next thing it has to do is find a seat that best fits the current rider's location, so whatever seat is closest to that location, and has a mounting position that fits within whatever is sent in here, or if it has an any mounting position. So if I break this out, switch. So if I break this out, you can see that the possible values for this is any side. So if this position comes back as anything, or if there is a seat within the pawn component that lists any as its mountable position, then it's one of the seats that will be eligible for this. But if it only has a left side, then only then any position that comes in here has to match that it is a left side seat or left side position that you are mounting from. So we're going to grab the mountable pawn component and do find analog, same analog, analogous. You know, it has the same analogous function on the component as it does the interface. So find available mounting position. And then we're just going to feed it in those variables. All right, next one is clear seat data by index. This is basically called by the dismounting system in order to clear a specified seat from the mount. So I'm going to grab mountable pawn component, clear seat by ID. Oh, no, sorry, index. Clear seat by index. This is one of those functions that for some reason I did not stick with my usual naming convention, and it should be clear seat at index, but now it's going to be stuck like that for a little while. So this is the only one that is clear seat by index instead of clear seat at index. The next one will be clear seat by ID. And it has this return value in case that the clearing function did not succeed. Maybe this seat ID is invalid, or that there's something wrong with the seat that's not available, something along those lines. But this basically returns true if succeeded or false if it did not. All right, can mount pawn. This is another special function for basically controlling if you can or cannot mount the pawn. The way I tend to set this up is, so we'll do get max writers is greater than get current writer count. And is a mountable pawn. So basically this function indicates that the pawn has some available seating in it, and it is in a state that it can currently be mounted. Can mount at position. This function actually works very similar to find available mounting position. And so to implement this, we're really just going to use that same function, but return true or false for it. Then set seat occupied is one of the deprecated functions that no longer technically should be used. And come 4.3 or 4.24 of the Unreal Engine, it's going to be one of those functions that gets removed. However, you can pretty much just, oh no, it's a set. You can pretty much call this same function. Set seat occupied by index with the writer, and that'll take care of that if you, for whatever reason, need to use it. But do note, this function is going away come Unreal Engine 4.24. And that is it for setting up the mount on the horse. Okay, so that wraps up this video, and in the next video, we'll be setting up the player controller. See you then.